Victories over women don't satisfy me anymore. I want to drink men's blood. Now, this is not me, Study Queen, talking, though I do love the quote, because it is a quote. It's a quote from the famous Vera Menchik, one of the most important women in the history of chess. And today we're gonna learn a little bit about Miss Menchik. So the first thing I wanted to show you guys is this book that I found. The book is in German, so we're not gonna read it, but if you look at the front page here, this is from a tournament in 1929, so almost 100 years ago. And here in the cover we see Miss Menchik sitting at the chessboard. She was one of the participants in this tournament, and opposite of her we see Capablanca, former world champion. And that is the good news about Vera Menchik. She declared that she wanted to play against men and win against men, and she managed to play some wonderful games, and we're going to take a look at one of her most beautiful games today. But first I wanted to talk a little bit about her childhood and her upbringing. So Vera Menchik, she was born in Moscow in 1906. Her father was Czech, her mother was English. And after the Russian Revolution, her family was forced to move from Russia, and they moved to England. And little Vera, she was a shy girl. She was not completely fluent in English yet, but she did know how to play chess. So she joined the local chess club in Hastings, and the masters at this chess club, they were quick to notice Vera Menchik because she improved so quickly, and soon she got a coach that was a Grandmaster Maroczy, maybe you've heard of him, and she moved on to win the Women World Championship 7 years in a row, and this is when she declared that she was now maybe not done playing women, but she wanted to also beat men in this beautiful game. And so today I wrote down one of her games in this little notebook, so let me see if I can find her. Yeah. I have some, after we've seen this game, I'm gonna tell you what happened after the game. Oh yeah, here it is. And we're gonna use the Chess Up 2 board to go through the game. This is one of the things that I really like to use this for. I just turn it on and I go into 2 players. Then for now I think we're going to do without any assistance. And then we can just play through any chess game that we like. And in this case we're going to look at the chess game Vera Menchik versus George Thomas. He was a national champion in England. And this game is from London, 1932. And Vera Menchik had the white pieces, and she started out with the move d2 to d4. George Thomas, he replied by putting his knight on f6. And Menchik put a pawn on c4, the most common second move in this position. Here there are several moves for black, of course, and George Thomas made this move g6. Knight c3 and bishop g7. And this right here is called the King's Indian defense, and it can be a very aggressive way for black to play, where they wait a little bit to challenge the center, but once they do, they will typically try to attack white on the king side. But let's see if that's how this game turns out. So after bishop g7, Vera Menchik, she played e4, further expanding her center here. d6 was now played, and Vera Menchik played this move f3. And I want to pause here and talk a little bit about this move, because it might look strange if you're not familiar with it. Maybe you're thinking, oh, shouldn't the knight go to f3? That would have been a developing move, and the knight would protect the pawn on d4. And while that's absolutely possible, there's nothing wrong with that, then this f3 move is really also quite strong. It's called the Sämisch variation after the German Grandmaster Friedrich Sämisch, and it's really supporting this central control that white already has. And it can be very, very hard for black to challenge this. Also, we're going to see that Vera Menchik is not necessarily interested in castling kingside. But we're still very much in the opening book, and this has been played thousands of times. George Thomas castled, very typical King's Indian style. Vera Menchik developed this bishop. Also notice how the pawn on f3 is preventing any knight or bishop from landing on g4. That's a nice little bonus about playing f3. George Thomas now put his pawn on e5. This is the most typical pawn break in the King's Indian, finally trying to do something about this white center, and maybe later they will play f5 and really try to make an attack happen on the king side. But Vera Menchik, she wasn't really having any of that, and after this move e5, she just developed knight g to e2. b6 was played, because this bishop is not really having too many options out here. This move is not good, neither is this or f5, so George Thomas thought maybe b7 or even a6 could be a better place to put the bishop. Vera Menchik put her queen on d2. And I think with this move we can kind of see what her intentions are. She's still a few moves from castling kingside, but suddenly the queenside castle looks pretty attractive. Knight c6 was played, and typically when this is played in the King's Indian, white takes the opportunity to push this pawn with a tempo. So now this knight has to move again, and it of course went to e7. I'm saying of course because the other options would be to put it back on b8. That doesn't look too good. Putting it here, white would be able to capture twice, gaining a pawn. And b4 and a5, white would probably be able to kick it with their pawns. So knight e7, and now we see that Vera Menchik, she is saying black is not going to be the one attacking on the king side. She is. After g4, black made another knight move, knight d7. Maybe you think this looks a little bit clumsy, putting the knights back like this, but really it's because black is almost always trying to go for the f5 break. But in this case it's quite difficult because not only is there white pawn on e4, there's also one on g4. So white has really good control over this square, and we'll see how this square plays a very important role in this game. Vera Menchik now put her rook on g1, saying that if black tries for something like f5 or h5, then this pawn will capture and the g file will become very, very fatal for the black king. So her poor opponent, George Thomas, he felt that it was necessary to kind of change his focus and then play on the queen side instead, which is not typically what black wants to do in the King's Indian. Vera Menchik castled the queen side, saying that she's not afraid of this pawn storm, or this play that black could maybe get on the queen side. She really believes in her chances on the king side. George Thomas put his knight on c5. That is a nice square, of course, for the knight. It is eyeing some potential checks here, like if Vera pushed the a-pawn, she was of course far too strong a player to do this. But then we see that this knight would go to b3, attacking the king and the queen. So after knight c5, Vera Menchik, she continued to build her attack on the king side by putting this knight on g3. and her opponent put his bishop on d7, kind of trying to activate it, looking at some squares over here, and also maybe getting ready to somehow get the queen active over on this side. We can see that Black's position feels a little bit cramped by these pawns, so he's really trying to maneuver his pieces on the few squares that aren't threatened by white. Okay, bishop d7, and Vera Menchik, she was ruthless. She just continued with this pawn storm. And Black said, okay, we have a typical position with opposite side castling, so he played the move a4, trying to see if this pawn can go to a3, see if it can maybe create some weaknesses around the white king. But this is one of the, even though I really enjoy having a fianchettoed bishop on g7, what can become a problem is sometimes this pawn on g6 can become a gateway for white to open up the position, either by going with the f pawn to f5 or going with the h pawn to h5. We call this a hook. So white will use this to open up the position and attack with the heavy pieces. Let's see, after a4, h5 was of course played, very logical play by Miss Menchik, and Black continued their play on the queen side with this queen b8. Now Vera Menchik grabbed the opportunity to remove one of Black's most important defensive pieces, so bishop h6, and Black really cannot avoid this trade because if the bishop drops back to h8, the bishop would be able to capture on f8. So instead, George Thomas used this move to kind of build his attack on this side of the board. Queen a7, and his plan is of course to push this pawn and try to open up a file to attack the white king. Vera Menchik, she made this trade, she captured on g7. Notice that this is the first capture in the game. It's quite late. This is in move 17. Black, of course, captured back with the king. But this king now is a little bit vulnerable. And I want to ask you if you could see if you can find any checks that white could give in this position. There are quite a few checks actually, some of them better than others. You could maybe push this pawn to h6. And while that doesn't look too bad, it doesn't really open up any files. White would really love to maybe open the G file, or the H file would also be something to strive for. Of course, you could put the queen on h6, but that sacrifice looks pretty dubious. But there is another check that's very interesting, and it was the one that she played. Knight to f5 check. Black really has to capture this knight, but how? If Black moves the king, of course, Vera Menchik would be able to win the knight on e7. But taking with the pawn is really not so nice for Black, because Miss Menchik would be able to recapture with a discovered check. And the next thing, the queen would jump to h6 or g5, and probably Black is going to be checkmated on g7. So instead he sensed the danger here and he captured with the knight to not allow any discovered checks for white. Miss Menchik now captured, of course, with the g-pawn. Of course, because she put her rook on g1 in order to open up this file and use it to attack the black king. Things are starting to look not so nice for this king, but there's also a king down here, and that's what George Thomas focused on now by pushing a3. Now, maybe Vera Menchik could have played b3, but it's also possible that George Thomas then would be able to sacrifice the knight and then push the a-pawn, because this would become a passed pawn, quite a dangerous passed pawn, as soon as this pawn would have captured on b3. So Vera Menchik, instead of doing anything over here, she just continued her attack on the black king. And she did this by putting her pawn on f6, of course with a check. Now capturing this pawn is very dangerous. I think capture would allow queen h6, and then the king would not be able to go back. It's possible that there are other moves, but the king really shouldn't be this brave and go all the way to the 6th rank with this many enemy pieces. So instead he dropped his king back to h8, asking Vera how she was going to continue the attack, but of course she had a plan for this, and she put her queen on h6. And I hope you can see the threat in this move. She's threatening, of course, to put her queen on g7, and that would lead to checkmate. So George Thomas here, he really had to come up with something quite clever, and he tried his best, I must admit. The first thing he did here, after this queen move, was that he captured on on b2, sorry. Not a bad move at all, as white has to be very careful now. If she captures this pawn, then we see that the black queen would drop to a3 with a check, and very quickly we can see that the initiative, the who's giving threats, who's threatening checkmate, would change in black's favor. So Vera Menchik did something very clever that I think we can all learn something from. She used this pawn as a shield and put her king in front of it, saying that now this pawn is actually blocking any checks, and of course the a2 pawn is perfectly well protected by the knight on c3. So this means that black can't really continue with anything over here. They have no good checks available and must protect the checkmate on g7. And he did this by putting the rook on g8. Now Miss Menchik, she just had a couple of more moves to play, and she of course found all the right ones. First she captured here, saying that black king is no longer in the g file. He moved so that he's now in the h file. So now the h file is the one that she wants to open. Black cannot take with the h pawn, that would be an illegal move. So he tried to capture with the f pawn instead. And here I want to challenge you to find the move that Miss Menchik played in this position. And I don't want to give you too many hints, but I can tell you that black resigned after the move she played here. Have you found it yet? I want to add that it's possible that there are more than one move that would win for white, but the absolutely most devastating move is the move that she played, which is queen captures h7, giving check to this poor black king. And of course it's easy to see that black has no other option than to take the queen, but once he does that, the rook will go to h1, not just giving check, but actually giving checkmate in a few moves. And so George Thomas, he was a gentleman and he resigned in this position, but I want to just show you how it could have ended if he hadn't seen what was coming after this capture. Rook here. It's not quite checkmate yet because black can block the check, but it won't save him at all because of course this rook just captures, and now we have checkmate, and that's why we see this beautiful pattern. So I really thought this was such a nice game, and really, I mean, we can see that Miss Menchik, she just completely destroyed the national champion in England in, I think, just 24 moves with a devastating attack. So she definitely got to both play and beat some of the strongest male players in the world. Now, while I set up the starting position, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about Menchik and what happened later in her life. So first of all, I wanted to tell you about the Menchik Club, Vera Menchik Club, because while she stayed in Hastings for a long time and played there, a club was founded in her name, but it wasn't really a normal chess club. It was a club where people would automatically become members if they had lost to Miss Menchik. And this club had several grandmaster members, including world champion Max Euwe, and a lot of other very prominent, strong players. Miss Menchik, she later became the director of the British National Chess Centre in 1939. Unfortunately, she only had this position for about a year because the building burned down after a Nazi bombing. And even more tragic was the fact that in 1944 another bomb hit Miss Menchik's home in London and took the life of both Vera and her mother and her sister. But even though her life ended way too early, her influence on chess was massive, and it's been an absolute honor to play through one of her best games. And of course, let me know if you want to see more games by Miss Menchik or any other historical chess players. Then I will be happy to find some beautiful games for us to go through. Also, if you like this sport and want to do this yourself, playing through master games, you can buy it with a 10% discount if you use my link and promo code in the description of this video.